The biggest danger that any leader has, and I don't care if it's a president or a prime minister or a CEO or a religious leader, community leader, the biggest danger is that people don't tell you the truth.
Welcome to Future Skills, where we prepare you for a future of accelerating change. I'm Ludvig Sunstrom.
And I'm Syding. This episode of Future Skills with Dr. Philippa Malmgren is edited by Alexander Martin. Pippa, short for Philippa, is a tech entrepreneur and a geopolitical consult. She has authored several books, including one of my personal favorites, called simply Signals and Geopolitics for Investors. In today's conversation, we focus on her most recent book, Leadership Lab, and learn about important neglected skills of good leaders, and why managers keep getting blindsided by well-known trends. We talk about important megatrends like big data and the Internet of Surveillance things, and how to adapt to technological change. Pippa is extremely productive, something she attributes to mostly working at just 80% of capacity. Among many thought-provoking ideas, we discussed see-through clothes, why even Philippa Malmgren finds resistance to her suggestions, and why you should replace your to-do list with a B-list. Finally, we get to know how Pippa does her best work while she appears to be sleeping in, why culture eats strategy for breakfast, and how eyes can't see clearly if imagination is out of focus. Now, let's dive right into the conversation with the hippophile and always amazing Dr. Philippa Malmgren.
Hey, so sorry, I'm a minute late. Sorry. No, I just forgot. It took me a minute to get logged into the Wi-Fi, that's all. But anyway, we should talk about the Leadership Lab. I might refer to Signals. My other book before was called Geopolitics for Investors, which I wrote in 2015. And at that time, people were like, who cares about geopolitics? And then it turns out it's made a big comeback as a subject. So I might make reference to the earlier books, but really the main one that people are going to access now is the Leadership Lab. And it's become a bestseller both in the US and the UK. And the FT named it a Business Book of the Month last month. And it just hit the CEO Goodreads top 20. It came in at number 16.
So regarding signals, you mentioned 5 different ways that a country can default on its debt.
So what I've argued since writing Signals is there's one other option that I did not discuss in the book. So the 5 ways are, you can just say, I'll never pay you back. That's what the Argentines did. You can say, I'll definitely pay you back, but a little bit later, maybe a little bit less. That's the Greek haircut. That's what the Greeks did. You can say to your own citizens, I know I made you promises, but we don't have enough money now. So certain things are going to happen. Like you won't be retiring at 65. You'll be retiring at like 92. And that's austerity. But all those are vote losers. And so governments always lean to option 4, which is inflation. And inevitably, they totally deny they're doing this. They say, don't be ridiculous. We're not inflating. But in fact, they are actually creating the conditions under which inflation comes back, namely low interest rates and money printing, which is what we had in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And surprise, surprise, we have inflation again. Or they'll say, don't worry, it's so small, it's no problem. But the reality is that inflation, it's not actually a data point. That's just a convenient way of thinking about it. It's a wave. It's an average of many, many data points. So some people get hurt a lot earlier and harder than others. And others don't ever feel it at all because they're so wealthy, they don't even notice the rent is rising. And I personally think that our choice of inflation has fueled populism because it's the pain of a higher cost of living against the backdrop of fewer government services and less confidence about the future that makes people start to say, hey, why are you in charge exactly? And that's the origin of populism. But if all those don't work, there is now one other option, which I describe in my new book, The Leadership Lab, which is you can abandon the entire system of money and accounting and start again. And everybody goes, what? That's crazy. But we did do this in the United Kingdom in 1834 when they had many decades of war debts and no means of paying it off. And they didn't want to default. And so they decided to introduce a new technology called paper money. Because for 1,000 years before 1834, the British had used a system of money and accounting called tally sticks. And the tally sticks, which is where we get the term tallying things up for the stock market. In fact, the term stock market comes from this system because they took a wooden board and cracked it in half very roughly. And the bigger part would go to the exchequer and would record all your tax payments. And the smaller half you would keep. That was called the stock end of the stick. And that created the origin of the term the stock market. And that would record every purchase you've ever made of a property, every tax payment, every borrowing or lending arrangement that you're in. And that was your personal sort of accounting record of your life. And so the public said, are you kidding? You want me to hand over these tally sticks with my personal record of my whole life in exchange for a piece of paper that doesn't even have my name on it? Are you kidding? And so the government said, fine, we'll confiscate the tally sticks and force you to use paper money, which is much easier to inflate with paper money, obviously. And they took all the tally sticks to Parliament in 1834 to burn them so that nobody could ever use them again. And in fact, misjudged how much heat would be thrown off by the fire. And that is what burned Parliament to the ground in 1834, was the destruction of the system of money and accounting. And the fact is, we have been using cash ever since. And what did we get in the aftermath of the destruction of the system? We got the fastest period of growth in modern history, the Industrial Revolution. So the equivalent today, I would say, we already know what it is. It's electronic money in conjunction with some kind of blockchain structure. In other words, a timestamp on every financial transaction, and it's conducted electronically. And we've seen India, for example, announce last year they took the public off of paper money and onto electronic money with almost no warning, and 1 billion people shifted in like 4 months. So governments everywhere are thinking maybe another way to get out of the debt problem is you just create an entirely new system of money. And the other advantage of this new electronic system is that it kind of kills the black economy because you can't do anything without being observed. All these electronic transactions leave footprints as to where you've been and who you did the transaction with. So no more under the table payments. And governments love this because it makes everything so transparent. In fact, it'll probably be ultimately a system where you don't even fill out a tax return because the tax is just automatically collected at the point of transaction. So I think when we think about the debt and how do we deal with it, we had these options, but we also have a new one that's worth thinking about.
How long do you think before government can just automatically fill out tax like you explained?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I think tax departments around the world are notoriously old-fashioned and not very tech savvy. However, I do think that the transition, once people decide to do it, will happen very quickly. And the fact is today, I think in industrialized countries, cash transactions are now less than 3% of all transactions. In other words, we're already most of the way there. Like there isn't that much further to go with creating an entirely electronic money and accounting system. And at that point, it's just a decision to create some automaticity, robotic response that allows the tax collection. Like it's not technically hard to do.
10 years ago, when I asked prospective employees, I used to ask, does all the money in Sweden fit in a certain famous building? And when I rechecked this case now, 10 years later, we actually only have half as much actual cash in Sweden, even though the economy has grown by like 50%.
Exactly, because it's all gone, especially in Scandinavia. All the Scandinavian countries are much better at electronic money than most of the rest of the world. I'm not sure I understand exactly why, but they have definitely gone down this electronic route very successfully.
All right, let's talk a little bit about technology and various geopolitical trends. This will be a difficult question, of course, but what do you think right now is the most important thing, all categories, that's going on in the world?
I love this question. I think the most important thing is the ubiquitous gathering of data about all of us, about the planet, and it's coming from multiple sources. So it's the data that we emit via our mobile device. which is not just our emails or our messages. It's capturing what level of the building you work on. It's capturing whether you're awake or you're asleep. It's capturing what's the condition of your heart, because the way you walk reveals your cardiac condition. So even if you don't have any fitness apps, your phone is gathering information about your walking gait and the attendant information that brings. But that's not all. It's also you're emitting information when you watch any kind of a screen, because there's a camera and it's capturing your emotional reactions to things, which is very valuable if you're trying to sell somebody something, to understand what their hot buttons are. It's also when you pass a camera in a department store. It is when you enter a hotel room, and increasingly hotel rooms have sensors underneath the carpet on the floor so they can track your physical use of the space. If you work in a WeWork building, for example, everybody thinks, WeWork, that's like a office sharing kind of arrangement. And everybody thinks that the reason WeWork is so valuable on the market is because they're very good at leasing office space. But they'll be the first to tell you the reason they're so valuable is because they have cameras embedded throughout their properties, and they are gathering data about how the humans use the space. So they're seeing if the coffee machine breaks, what happens? How many people suddenly stop working and become unproductive? Or if we put a sofa in a corner, do people hold meetings there or not hold meetings there? In other words, it's ubiquitous gathering of data. Now, in the past, all these silos of data were independent, but now artificial intelligence is connecting the dots between the silos. So the reason this matters is it's creating the ability to have a understanding of reality that is more accurate and precise than looking at reality itself. It creates quadrillions of data points that create almost like a holographic data sphere. And it's literally like a crystal ball. It's a place of radical transparency where you can conjure forth much better answers to questions. So I'll give you an example. I was talking to the head of a big insurance company the other day, one of the biggest in the world. And the guy says, we used to ask when we were insuring drivers, is the driver male or female? Are they young or old? Are they a good driver or a bad driver? What's the record? Is it raining or snowing? Now, because of looking through the crystal ball and seeing reality much more clearly, they realize all of those questions are irrelevant. And the only question that matters is the stretch of road you are driving on inclined to have accidents? Or is the stretch of road you're on not inclined to accidents? And your insurance rate should fluctuate depending on which roads you drive on. It's a completely different way of comprehending reality. Now, this is all being turbocharged by governments who are engaged in the new space race, which is to create the computational power that allows you to process all these quadrillions of data points. So the Americans have announced they have a computer called Summit, which we keep at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. That's where we keep our nuclear capability, to give you an idea of how very valuable this is. And Summit can calculate in 1 second what takes a human being 6.3 billion years, billion with a B, to calculate. By the way, I don't even know how they come up with that number. Like, does that allow for bathroom breaks? I don't know, but it's incredible how much computational power is available now. The Chinese are building a facility in Anhui province in China, and it is said that when it's completed in 2020, it will have 1 million times the computational power of the entire planet today. Now, why are governments engaged in this? It's partly because if you've got all that data and you want to manage your citizens, you have to be able to manage the data. And the Chinese are doing that with this new social credit system where they take all this information and basically give you a score, like an Uber score. And that score reflects your level of social compliance. So if you jaywalk, not only do you get a text message immediately before you're even across the street with the fine, but your score goes down because you've done something not socially compliant. So they need a lot of computational power to manage that system. In the West, we do it more in private companies rather than government level. But either way, the one thing you can do if you have a huge amount of computer power is break the other guy's codes. And it doesn't matter if they're nuclear codes or they're Bitcoin codes or laptop codes. Basically, codes become incredibly vulnerable in that environment. And I think if people really understood this is an entirely new operating environment for the human race. It's a different way of comprehending reality. It brings new governance issues because it changes the balance of power between the state and the citizen, between the company and the customer, between individuals and society. If people really understood what all I've just said, I think they would be like, oh, the implications of this are mind-blowing. Both positively, because this is where we solve cancer and many intractable problems, but it's also where we see a lot of scary results as well. And I think everybody needs to think about how are they going to operate in this new space.
We are entering a much more potentially effective period for humanity. But as you said, this is bordering on minority report, because with all that data and AI and quantum computing perhaps, then we actually have like those three precognition people actually predicting the future.
Definitely. And in fact, for example, banks already use artificial intelligence and algorithmic analysis to determine when a divorce is coming in a household. They know the divorce is coming before you know, because they can see in the spending and the living patterns what's happening in the home. And what they do is drag down the credit limit of the lower earning partner in anticipation of the financial crunch that's going to happen when the divorce actually occurs. So this is the thing. People go, well, I don't mind my data being all available because it's just going to give me better advertising for the stuff I'm interested in. And then I go, yeah, but what if it actually cuts the credit card limit because it knows that you're about to be divorced? Then they go, oh, that's not so cool. Well, that's going to happen on everything. It's going to notice what your eating patterns are and alert the insurance companies. I mean, John Hancock, which is one of the biggest life insurers in the United States, has just announced they will only sell life insurance policies linked to fitness devices that you wear on your body like a Fitbit. In other words, unless you are emitting that data, you are not insured. So now they're going to see what's happening to you quicker than you can even see it and judge you based on that. And this is the world we're entering. So it's not even sci-fi bordering on Minority Report. It is the Minority Report already.
Yeah. But when it comes to private companies, I actually think this is kind of fair. It's just when governments get this power that I get a bit scared.
Interesting. I hear this argument a lot. And especially a lot of the Silicon Valley companies, they make this because they think they're benevolent. So they'll only do good things with the information. But who knows who the next leader of one of those companies might be? I mean, you can get a Donald Trump can show up in the private sector too, So,
but I was just thinking about the divorce example and an insurance example, because that means that if you really behave, you will get what is a fair and lower price.
Yes, but here's my big question. So I'm with Frank Zappa, who said, all progress comes from deviating from the norm. You can't get progress unless you deviate from the norm. But this system of scoring people basically penalizes you for deviating from the norm. And so in some instances, that may be beneficial, like, as you say, for your health data. If you comply and you get on the running machine and you eat well, you get rewarded. But that also means if you don't, you get penalized. And do we want a society where just because someone's in bad physical shape, we diminish their voice in other ways? Maybe we don't. Maybe we want diversity of people. We don't want when you start talking about a society where everybody's fit, you kind of start to have images of, the Germans and going into World War II with the ideal human. I'm just saying, I think diversity matters, and our system of scoring people and mathematically placing them into narrower boxes might diminish our diversity.
So do you see different trends like these that are converging into incentivizing conformity? Is that what you're saying?
That is what I'm saying. I think it's a big risk. And you can see it in lots of ways. Like, for example, the fact that the news that we read is so driven by the algorithms. So whatever we read, the algorithms give us more of that stuff. So you get to see less and less of anything that diverges from your opinion or your areas of interest. So you're getting channeled into narrower and narrower news feeds without even realizing it. And is that right? Is that a good result? Or is that actually now reinforcing our own perceptions of reality and creating a world where everybody actually reads and sees a totally different reality? There is no shared common space because the algorithm has taken that away.
Yeah, that's really hard to say, because on the one hand, for example, on Twitter, it's very easy to mute conversations or people that offend you. And that puts you in your own little echo chamber. But at the same time, you really need that function to avoid bullying.
Yeah. And I think right now the zeitgeist is very much either you agree with me or you're either evil or an idiot. You know, we've lost our ability to engage in civil dialogue. And this is a serious problem because you can't have civil society if you don't have civil dialogue. But if you believe that everyone with a different opinion from your own is evil or an idiot, well, this is no basis for civil dialogue, and it's actually no basis for learning. So I try to read an incredibly wide array of things, many things I really disagree with. I like to read about stuff that I don't know anything about, but the algorithms fight me all the time. And in fact, some of the platforms, I use Twitter a lot, and I notice, on Twitter, if people see you following certain people, they somehow believe that you must support their views. So I had to actually put on my Twitter page, retweets do not equal endorsements, because I sometimes do retweet stuff because it's not that I agree. It's just that I think it's very interesting, and I think we should consider the argument, or be aware that someone's making the argument, and not condemn it just because it's different from our own opinion. But this requires real effort in the modern era. This is the easy thing, is to let the algorithm slide you into a tiny little space where you're in your own echo chamber, as you say.
Just the other day, I listened to a TED Talk with a teacher who got a lot of hate mail because of her ethnic background. And in the end, she decided to start having coffee with the ones who sent the absolute worst racist emails to her.
Oh, interesting.
So she started by meeting with this neo-Nazi, super racist guy, and they actually did have coffee. And after that, she had coffee like with similar people once a week for 8 years before doing this TED Talk. So you can talk about going out on a limb in terms of really seeking out the other view.
And what was her conclusion? Did she change their opinion? Did she find any common ground? Did it restore her faith in humanity or undermine it?
She first and foremost realized that there is a difference between a person and their opinion.
Yes.
You can agree with a person, and you can actually even like a person and find them likable, even though you absolutely detest their views.
Yes.
And so her conclusion was also that everybody should try to do this at least at once.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I agree with that. I think it's, one has to make a kind of permanent commitment to getting out of the comfort zone, because we're being directed into our comfort zone so relentlessly. We have to fight against that constantly.
And probably we're just afraid. We're always afraid of going outside our comfort zone, and not least when it comes to, for example, racism.
Well, in fact, that's the topic. It's a theme of the next book that I'm working on, which is really about why human beings are so afraid of change, because we're in this period of radical technological change. I think that's only on a par with the Industrial Revolution, and I see it being a super positive thing. But I feel there's so much fear out there, and I'm trying to get a grip on why are people so afraid. And I think they're really afraid of change. And why is that? And could we fix it by encouraging people to try every single day to do at least one thing that is outside your comfort zone? And it doesn't matter if that's eating a new kind of food, or talking to someone that you would normally have never talked to, or walking to work on a different path than normally. But it's a way of training your brain to get more comfortable in a wide wider space than normal.
Yeah, this is really Ludvig's area. He actually released a book about a year ago called Breaking Out of Homeostasis, which entire philosophy are built around that.
Yeah, it's a bit nerdy, but I think it's very good. I'm actually working on the expanded physical version.
I love that cartoon that shows two dots, two circles. And one is, life inside the comfort zone. And the other one is where all the exciting things happen.
Yeah, I love that one. Yeah, I know exactly which one.
And we should be where all the exciting things happen.
I want to ask you a little bit about your background, because you worked as, is advisor the right term? But like you've been working with a lot of the world leaders, like George W. Bush and former Prime Minister. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, but Manmohan Singh. And I'm wondering, what is it like to operate as an advisor to these world leaders?
It is totally fascinating. It's a real privilege. I was so lucky because my father served 4 presidents, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. And I grew up in Chevy Chase, Maryland, which is where a lot of the politicians live. So, having the senator on one side and the deputy head of the CIA on the other, these people were just my neighbors. They were the fathers of my friends. And as a result, I just treat them as normal people. And that's allowed me to be able to work with them in a very interesting way, because most people get overwhelmed by power. And I know this is going to sound strange, but I really understood this one day when I was working for President Bush, and a CEO came in to see me on the way in to see President Bush. And he goes, the president's policies are terrible, and the Secretary of Treasury ought to be fired. And he had all these negative views. And I said, excellent. Let's walk over to the Oval Office. You need to tell the president what you think, because he needs to hear what real opinions are. So the whole way over, he's, chewing my ear off with negative views. But the moment we stepped into the Oval Office, he suddenly was transformed. And he says, "Oh, Mr. President, I am so delighted to meet you. It's an absolute honor, sir." And then he didn't say a darn thing about his complaints. I said, "Wait a minute, what happened to you?" And the answer is, the character Gollum in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, the evil character who wants the ring of power and says, my precious, my precious. Gollum lives above the door of the Oval Office and jumps on your shoulder when you walk in there and says to you, don't say what you actually think. Say what you want them to hear, because then you'll have power. And I could see this guy was literally thinking, I might be ambassador to the country of my choice. I might get to fly on Air Force One. And suddenly you realize that he turns, like most hobbits, into this gremlin. And the real test when you want to advise leaders is to be a hobbit that remains a hobbit and can handle the ring of power. And this takes me to this funny notion, but the Oval Office is a round space. There are very few buildings that have round architectural spaces. Cathedrals have them, churches have them, parliaments have them. They're meant to convey this is a place of power. It's the ring, just like in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And so if you want to advise people at that level, you have to ask yourself, what kind of character am I? Because the biggest danger that any leader has, and I don't care if it's a president or prime minister or a CEO or a religious leader, community leader, the biggest danger is that people don't tell you the truth. And so this is why I'm so delighted to have this opportunity to be in this space. And for me, it's kind of just an everyday job. You go in, you go, hey, hi, how are you? This is what I see happening in the world, and have a chat.
And I read that you recommended a specific book for those who were getting into this kind of career. And if I remember correctly, the book was The Uses of History for Decision Makers.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you still recommend the book, and also if you could kind of contrast it towards, a more popular book like Lessons of History by Will and Ariel Durant.
Yeah, actually, both of those are excellent books. There's one other, by the way, that I think is very important called Thinking in Time. And I think that was released maybe in the 70s. It's, by any measure, you would think these are all out of date, but actually they're not. And so learning how to make decisions very, very quickly when you don't have enough information or time to make it comfortably. Because then when you work at the level of the head of government or even the head of a company, that's how you have to operate all the time. So you have to get comfortable with how to do it. One of the most interesting skills, valuable skills that I think exists is the ability to write a memo to the president. And the president every single day gets what they call the briefing book, which is full of individual memos. Each one is not more than half a page, and it contains a paragraph, maybe two, and then 3 positive options the president to choose from on that issue. And so imagine the most complicated, difficult, demanding issues in the world, because those are the only ones that rise to the level of the president. Everything else gets fixed somewhere underneath. So only the super tricky stuff comes to the Oval Office, and you've got to narrow that down to half a page max. That is an amazing skill set. And Thinking in Time and the other books that you've mentioned, those are all helpful in getting you to think this way. Because again, the thing is, you don't have the luxury of time. You just don't. It's time gets compressed the higher you go up the hierarchy.
It sounds almost like, I think it was Colin Powell who said he had this principle that you should make a decision between 40 to 70% information gathered. Are you familiar with this?
Absolutely, and he's right. That's exactly right, because that's the best you're going to have, because you just simply don't have the privilege of time to be at 100%. And another thing that I think is useful is that whatever business you're in, whatever role you play, you should try and operate at about an 80% level of efficiency. In other words, 20% of your time ought to be doing nothing. And everybody goes, that's crazy. I'll get fired if I only operate 80%. But this is what they do in Formula One racing, because they know for sure there's going to be an accident. And for sure if you work in the White House, there's definitely going to be an accident. You'll be lucky if there's an accident every other day. There's going to be an event. There's going to be something. So if you're operating at 100%, then there's no option except to drop something that's important in order to make space for the emergency. But if instead you operate at 80%, it actually means now everybody gets more rest. They get more mental rest. So they're readier when the event happens. Now you have space to deal with that event and take it back down to the non-emergency level. And it's just a different way of thinking the use of time in a day. If you have humans operating at 100% all the time, you get accidents, you get burnout, you get fights, you get bad memos. It's a bad outcome. Humans need to operate at a lower level of efficiency to make space for both rest and the unexpected.
So in that case, if you take a hyper-competitive environment like, big banks, trading floors, or the White House, is it then the leader's job to kind of be conscious and look out for those below and make sure that they have their basic needs filled and that they're sleeping correctly, for example?
I actually do. And I would go further and say it is their job to create the culture that gives permission. So, for example, my co-author on my new book, The Leadership Lab, Chris Lewis, he is very big. His prior book was called Too Fast to Think. And the big message there was the way human beings solve problems, when they get their epiphanies, their truly creative solution, it never happens when they're trying. It never happens when they're at work. It doesn't happen in meetings. It happens when they are not working, when they're not trying, when they're not in meetings. It's usually when they're washing the dishes or they're taking a shower or they're in the bath or they're gardening, and suddenly they go, I have the answer. And it's because the way the brain works, it needs creative time. Einstein said that intelligence is the residue of, or creativity is the residue of time lost. It's time wasted, seemingly wasted, but it isn't, because your brain is still firing. It's connecting the dots. So if you have a culture in an organization where the leader says, I want you operating at 80% because I need you to do a little bit of time wasting so that you can come up with creative answers to the world's most difficult problems, that is a very, very good use of leadership. But unfortunately, too few leaders actually do that. Too few people feel they have permission to be creative in that way. And maybe this explains why we have a lot of problems we're not solving creatively.
And it's also like you see other people who maybe, I don't know, who have I don't know, some sort of normal job. And then they see people who do this, and they're wondering, why are you not doing anything? Yeah. But they don't understand your thinking. It's like Einstein also said, I believe, that someone who's doing something at a higher level, that person looks stupid to you. Yes. if you're not on that level. So it's like you can't comprehend the different modus operandi because it's just not what you're doing.
Exactly. I think if someone filmed me during my day, they would be like, oh my God, she's not doing anything, especially in the mornings. I'm not a morning person. I'm a night owl. So when I wake up in the morning, the period I love best is when you're halfway between being asleep and awake, where your subconscious is handing off to your consciousness. And in that halfway place, I do a lot of my creative thinking that forms the foundation for my public speaking and my books that I write. That's where I connect the dots in a very unfocused way. It just comes to me. But if somebody filmed me, they'd be like, she's not doing anything. She's just lying there. But the fact is, I can't do my work without that very rigorous period. It just doesn't look like I'm doing anything.
How do you capture those insights? What do you actually do purely physically to make sure you don't forget what you create at those moments?
Well, I write them down, and the little note function on an iPhone, you should see mine. It's ridiculous. I just have hundreds of pages of notes to myself, and I take images that spur my imaginative process, and books that I've come across, references to, I'll take quotes and I'll capture them like a magpie. And you can see this in my books because I kind of have this huge array of quotes, marvelous quotes from people. Like, I love Mark Twain's wonderful quote where he says, the eyes cannot see clearly if the imagination is out of focus. And I think that's absolutely right. But where did I get that? I don't even know. I picked it up like a bird. It was a shiny quote. I grabbed it. I put it into my phone, and then I keep coming back to it in moments. And suddenly I weave a story around it, and it becomes the foundation for a chapter in a book.
Is that a chapter in the Leadership Lab? Because it sounds like something that managers or leaders are missing.
It is. It's a big theme in the Leadership Lab is we need to exercise much more imagination. And the problem, we say, is 20th century leaders, in fact, 20th century, all of us, we've all been trained to be highly analytical. That means we drill down into data, looking more and more at numbers. But the problem is the answers are not exclusively in things we can quantify. So in addition to the analytical, we need to learn to exercise the parenthetical. Now, what I mean by parenthetical is the ability to look across the landscape, to connect the dots between seemingly unrelated ideas or silos of information. It's about not just measuring the math, which is an analytical function, but measuring the mood, which is a parenthetical approach. Not just understanding the facts, but comprehending the feelings. And so this requires us to be more imaginative in our process. And by bringing the two together, you begin to have a more holistic understanding of reality, which leaves you less vulnerable to being blindsided. And heavens knows, everybody's been blindsided, right? They all said Trump will never win and Brexit will never happen and the slowdown in China won't occur. All these things have occurred. So we need to get better at imagination. Another thing that contributes to this is moving people away from their inclination to engage in prediction. And you find people everywhere. They love saying Trump will never win. And you're like, that's a prediction. And it's a hell of a bet. And if you get the bet wrong, it's an expensive bet to lose. What makes much more sense is to focus on preparedness. And that means having the imagination to consider many different possible outcomes, not just binary ones as well. Like, I live in the UK right now, and I'm helping advise the government on Brexit and policy post-Brexit. And people are always like, it's either Britain succeeds or the EU succeeds. And I'm like, wait a minute, why can't they both succeed with very different business models? We have more than 100 countries in the world, and many of them are succeeding simultaneously in totally different ways. And everybody goes, oh, I never thought of that. And why? Because their imagination takes them to binary places, when in fact your imagination should take you to a whole rainbow of possibilities. And that's very much the message in the Leadership Lab. At the core, what you really want is diversity of thinking, not binary thinking, but diversity of thinking.
So this can obviously be applied in different ways. And I'm not sure whether, it's going to be different if it's a company or a government, but let's just take both examples. Let's say you want to have this new kind of broad thinking leaders. How should they sort of like select them or filter for these capabilities?
Well, this is an excellent question. And my co-author, Chris, and I tried very hard to give very practical examples of how to create a culture. Because culture eats strategy for breakfast. Remember, that's what Peter Drucker said. We can all have strategy, but a culture creates the real environment. So if you want more diversity, for example, most meetings are held on the basis of whoever talks first and loudest wins. Well, then you miss a lot of voices that are quieter. Those might be, for example, women, right? You get less gender diversity if you have that approach. But there are also men who might be more quiet, more reticent, that aren't speaking up. So if you shift and you say, meetings will be held on an equal time basis, everybody gets 5 minutes. Well, first it compels everyone to say something. So now your quiet people start to tell you their thoughts. It creates a place where people are permitted to have a different opinion because it's not so confrontational as the loud person who wins. And suddenly you've created an atmosphere, a culture where the diversity of thinking is easier to access. That's just one small example. We tried to give many, many practical examples throughout the book of how to cultivate a culture that encourages diversity of thinking.
I think that a fourth thing that it does also is that, going back to what you said before, it cultivates preparedness because you know that you will have your 5 minutes or whatever, and then you can't sit quiet. You have to prepare something to say. You can't just think that you can coast off of other people who are going to talk all the time.
Totally. Absolutely. The other thing on this vein we found was that the studies show very clearly that we confuse confidence with competence. And this is a dangerous thing. Typically, the surveys and studies are showing that men are inclined, for whatever reason, to put their hand up and say, I am ready for a job or I have an opinion, when they're only something between 40 and 60% ready. Women, on the other hand, typically won't put their hand up or let their name go forward until they're 100% sure. They're just different degrees of risk management. Now, that's not true for every woman or every man, but just on average, that tends to be the case. So we have a habit of thinking, well, if someone's really confident, they must be competent. So we promote guys who are only 40 to 60% ready, and women who are waiting till they're 100%. They also have a tendency to double check their work. Well, if you double check your work, you definitely lack confidence, right? So you not only don't promote them, you kind of treat them as slightly psychopathic. Like, why would I want such an unconfident person in my organization? And we know the end result. You end up with a lot of blustery people up at the top. Not to say women can't be in this category too, but blustery people who go, I can do this. When in fact, the people who really could do it don't say anything. So this is again about a culture issue of promoting competence instead of confidence, or cultivating confidence amongst the competent, or vice versa. Take your confident people and make them more competent.
Do you think that spending on experiences and focusing on high earners as a general field of business is becoming more important going into the future?
I definitely think there is a real trend away from buying things to buying experiences. This is apparent in the luxury goods sector. But it's a broader phenomena. I actually think even for people in low income, that it used to be an aspirational person focused on a material acquisition. I want to buy a car. I want a house. I want an education, maybe even. But because the financial crisis and the debt problem have been so severe, people have been so constrained in their ability to buy things. They've shifted to, I'd rather experience something. And this is bringing back things like people reading books, people learning how to paint, travel that is experiential in nature. And it's at every level of prosperity and income, from the top to the bottom. And the fact is that humans actually find experiences more interesting. Experiences tend to be more one-off in nature. I mean, I can go buy a handbag, but there are a lot of people who could also buy the same handbag. But if I go to a concert that's not being held 100 nights in a row, but only 2 nights in a row, and I go with a certain group of friends, it's a kind of one-off thing that's not repeatable. I can talk about that concert for years to come. The handbag, maybe I could talk about that for a week, but even that's boring. Buying things doesn't give you stuff to talk about in the way that experiences do. And I actually think it's a healthy shift that we move away from materiality to experience-based living.
Maybe that could actually also open up for more women in leadership roles. I'm thinking of Jordan Peterson. He talks about research showing that men are more interested in things and women in experiences. And this could be a way of, because if experiences and people really are becoming more in focus, then maybe women leaders also could make those companies more profitable.
That's very interesting. I do think, look, here's the bottom line. We don't talk about diversity or do it because it's nice. It's because it's incredibly efficient. It raises profitability, hands down, no question about it. You get something between a 25% and 32% jump in profitability when you have a more diverse management team. You get better quality work environments that people appreciate being in more. In other words, it's not because it's nice, it's because it's smart.
We talked a lot about various aspects of the book, but perhaps if you could in some way summarize really what's the main bearing idea, and also why did you choose to write the book?
So let me start with why. Both Chris and I are advising leaders around the world, and we found that in every category of leadership, we've been having extraordinary crisis. Everything from the automakers lying about the emissions, to the Catholic Church having scandals around sex issues, to politics. I mean, there isn't a category of leadership that isn't experiencing a severe crisis and a breakdown of trust. So we started to look at it and say, well, what do these leaders have in common? Well, we couldn't help but observe they're typically men. They're of a certain age. Now, that doesn't mean this is the cause. It's just this is who they are. And we started to talk to them about their experience. And what they said was, I've been totally blindsided by what's going on in the world. I didn't see stuff coming. Now, why didn't they see it coming? We found out it's because they only talk to a small group of people they've known a long time. Because the higher you go, the smaller your network of trusted people is. And those people are equally disconnected from what's going on. And we realize they're all operating on assumptions that are roughly 10 years out of date. So they'll say stuff like, all the jobs are moving to China. And you say, well, that was true, but actually Foxconn, which is the biggest maker of iPhones in the world and the second biggest employer in China, they've just built a factory in Wisconsin because Wisconsin's more competitive than Shenzhen. And then they go, I didn't know that. Well, the fact that they don't know this is obvious to everybody around them, and especially younger people who do know this, and they won't follow them because they don't even know where they are on the landscape. So we thought, okay, another thing is they said, I'm very analytical. And we realize they don't have any parenthetical skills. And that's, again, why they miss what's going on, why they think that leadership is about the leader, when in fact, it's about the ship. So how do we change their orientation? How do we reorient them on the global landscape? We need to write a book that shows them the whole landscape. And that's why some people have said the book is very ambitious, because we talk about everything. We have a chapter on technology. We have a chapter on gender and diversity. We, totally different topics. And people are like, wow, we cover so much territory. And we said, well, it's not that. What we're doing is standing on the mountain and describing the landscape as it is, not how you wish it to be, not how you remember it was, but how it really is today. And that has turned out to be an eye-opener, because many people really didn't see it before. They didn't understand this crystal ball of data. They didn't understand they were being analytical and they had no parenthetical skills. They just didn't see it. So that was our reason for writing it, was to really be a bit of a knife to the throat of the current generation of leaders and say, either you reorient yourself and get this or you're going to be out. And it's an invitation to the next generation of leaders to say, hurry up and bring all of your skill and your talent and your observations and your parenthetical as well as your analytical, because the world needs it, because we've got to stop having all these crises. And the way to do it is to better understand what reality is and manage it in a 21st century way, which is different from the 20th century way.
So this example that you gave with Foxconn moving their factory, I did not know this. And I'm wondering, when you study in general or just learn things throughout the day, what kind of mediums are you looking at? How do you choose how to spend your time in terms of looking at different sources of information? Like almost like an information portfolio.
Yeah, no, I get asked this a lot. And the real answer is I'm in such a privileged position because I get to sit down with political leaders in many parts of the world, business leaders in many parts of the world, the biggest investors all over the world. So in other words, my sources are mainly original sources. So I talk to them, and what I heard and I wrote about in my last book, Signals, I could hear the businesses all saying, you know what, it's becoming actually quite expensive to manufacture in China. And post-financial crisis, it's actually amazing how inexpensive workers in the Midwest of the United States are. So we're going to start putting more of our focus in the middle of the US and less of our focus in China. Now, there was no data that supported that at the time, but because I was hearing the stories, I thought, oh, this is an important trend and it will show up in the data. So I like to put these stories up when I find them on Twitter, which populates my Facebook page, to spread this out, because what I think is most important is the stuff that is not yet in the data. That was the topic of my book, Signals, how everyday signs help us navigate the world's turbulent economy, which is probably too long of a title. But it was about, if you only look at the data, by definition, you can only be backward looking. And by the way, data includes news stories. So if you're reading the newspaper or the net, most of that is about the past. What I'm interested in is the future. And the past doesn't always tell you about the future because life is not linear. So I guess my answer is I open my eyes and my ears rather than specifically reading particular news sources.
I just came to think about Janet Yellen, the former Fed chairman. She says that she only looks at data that's at least 3 years old, because then it's been through all the adjustments, and that's before that it's not statistically significant to her.
I know. So she and I would be in big arguments, because I would say inflation is so severe that it's giving rise to populism. I mean, everywhere in the world, I talk to young people and they go, do you know what is happening to rent? I cannot afford to live within 2 hours of where I work, whether they're in Beijing or Shanghai or Silicon Valley or London. Like, there isn't a megatropolis that isn't experiencing radical increases in rent. And that's a huge component of somebody's life. And Janet Yellen would say, but the data shows there's no inflation. And I would go, but everybody is in the bar talking about how they can't afford rent or healthcare, and they're going to move to the Midwest because they can't afford to live in San Francisco anymore. And she would say, this is all anecdotal stories. And I would say, yes, absolutely. And these anecdotal stories have value because they tell us about what is going to be in the data in the future, which is where the real value is. Because by the time all this is in the data, it's too late to do anything about it. It's too late to invest in it. It's too late to change public policy for it. You're supposed to get in front of the data.
The Swedish central bank has recently stated officially that if inflation becomes too high, then it just lowers the interest rate because that lowers the interest rate component in the inflation measure. That's just really backwards.
Totally. And again, how do we measure this darn thing? I think it's important to understand the inflation rate is not a data point. It's an average. It's a wave. So the real question is who gets hurt first and hardest by that wave and who never feels it? And how does it show up? So an example I used in my book Signals was lipstick. And I figured, why is economics always about steel and auto parts? Why can't we talk about lipstick, right? That's a huge component of the economy too, makeup. So in England, they have a basket of goods they use to measure what is inflation. And I can't remember exactly the year, maybe it was 2012 or 2013. They shifted from lipstick to lip gloss. They said, okay, we're no longer going to measure lipstick prices. We're going to measure lip gloss because the public has moved more towards lip gloss. Well, I'm a woman and I can tell you we wear both and we wear each in like 10 shades. So what I'm actually buying is both lipstick and lip gloss, at least in 10 different colors. So my actual expenditure is rising because lipstick is always more expensive than lip gloss. And since I'm still buying lipstick, I have to pay that. So my inflation rate is definitely rising in the makeup category. But the central bank in Britain said to me, no, it's falling because we determined that you are only wearing lip gloss. So this is, again, what's in the basket versus what is in people's real lives. Another example of this is you can say as an economist, well, if steak, right, beef is becoming expensive, then rational people will buy tofu, right? Because tofu is still protein, but less expensive. And I say, yes, in theory, but I don't know how to cook tofu. And I don't know that many people who are really great at making cool stuff out of tofu. In other words, it's not immediately substitutable, even though technically they're both just forms of protein. But the reality is you can't say to the Chinese, look, I know pork is your most important food item, but could you just eat shrimp for a while? No, pork is the thing that their whole economy, their whole culture is based on. Or if you go to the Middle East, it's wheat, which is why I saw the Arab Spring coming. And I said, I think we're going to have a big problem because the wheat price is going through the roof and we're going to get inflation. And this always causes social unrest. And people were like, what? And they could eat rice. I'm like, but they don't eat rice. They eat wheat. And you can't substitute. You can't tell the Mexicans when the corn price goes up to go eat, I don't know, something completely unrelated. Human beings have their comfort zone and it matters. So this is back to the very big differences between the way a Janet Yellen thinks about understanding the economy and the way I'm proposing. Mine is much more based in signals and stories, and hers is based in data and analytics.
And the underlying in what you're saying is kind of that the consumer price index is a tricky thing.
Yeah, definitely. It's a choice. It's a series of choices.
Now, you have access to these original sources, but most people don't. And apart from maybe following you on Twitter, how do you suggest people, where should they begin looking for signals?
I think you have to start looking around you. So, for example, when I started to argue 4 or 5 years ago that inflation was beginning to come back, one of the things I noticed was every time I went into a restaurant, the size of the main course, whether it was a burger or a steak or even a salad, it just kept getting smaller. The price stayed the same, but the amount on the plate was getting less and less and less. Or you go into the grocery store and The amount of cereal in the cereal box is less and less. The box is the same size. The price is the same, but there's less inside. There are fewer potato chips in the bag. There are fewer cookies in the box. So to me, this is where the story begins. Now I start to go, that would mean the only reason the company would do that is they're trying to protect their income. So it must be their input costs are rising and they're trying to keep the price the same and capture the difference. So then I start to look for what's happening to prices. And I start to see inflation building in remote corners. And that tells me the wave is starting to form. I also get interested in fashion, for example. In the last 2-3 years, one of the most significant trends in fashion has been for completely transparent fabrics. And I mean either like plastic that's see-through, like jeans that are completely see-through, or handbags that are completely see-through. Believe me, I can't understand how people wear them exactly, but nonetheless, they've been uber popular items. Or very, very transparent lace or sheer fabrics. You know, you can see it in all the dresses that all these Hollywood actresses are wearing. They're practically not even there. They're so sheer. Personally, I look at that and I say, well, humans like to reflect their views in what they wear. This is a cry for transparency. This is a powerful part of populism expressing itself. And you might say, well, that's crazy. It's just coincidental. Maybe, but I say, look, artists are very good at capturing zeitgeist, and fashion is made by artists. And I look at what the artists are trying to tell us. There are very important signals from that world. Anyway, and once you start to observe these things that don't make sense to you, then you start to follow the story in the news. You'll start to see it. Like today, I took a taxi in London and I went to, the charge was less than £10. And I went to pay with my debit card because we're all using cards these days. We don't carry cash. And I didn't notice the guy had a sign saying, any charge below £10 on a card, we're going to charge you 10. So my fare was £7.40. And he said, oh, if you're paying with a card, it's £10. In other words, he just made an extra, couple of pounds off me because I didn't have cash. That is a signal that taxi fares are going to rise because it's a kind of sneaky way of getting cash off the customer. This is how I think we should begin. And once you start observing, the stories will begin to jump out at you in the press that you read.
Since you are so familiar with the politicians and company leaders, that has put you in a very special position for your career, since you are very comfortable in those situations. But I'm wondering if the tables might be turning, so you are becoming such an imposing celebrity that they become starstruck when you meet them, and it becomes difficult for them to actually heed your advice.
Oh, that's a very interesting way to think about it. I'm not sure anybody's starstruck by me, but I don't know. I think I don't feel that at all. What I do feel is that it doesn't matter how many times you're right. If your view is so far out of the normal way of thinking, people find it very hard to accept it. So, for example, one of my big views has been Mexico is the new China. Now, that's a radical view, but I look at it and I go, okay, Chinese wages are very high now. Like I said, the Midwest is more competitive than China. Mexican wages are 20 to 40% cheaper than China, but their quality control is American standard. The Chinese are investing in Mexico in a massive way. Everybody should Google the proposed new airport in Mexico City because it's a glorious, beautiful building that will probably be rivaled only by Shanghai Airport, an extraordinary glass structure. Why are the Chinese investing in such a big way in a country like Mexico? Because they agree that Mexico is the new low-wage, high-quality location, and they'd better be involved with it or they're not going to have any income. So when I say that to people, they're like, that can't be true. And they'll come up with 10 million reasons why Mexico is nothing like China. And yet the investment returns of being involved in Mexico have been fantastic. In fact, the hottest part of the world economy is the Mexico-Texas nexus, as it were, which is so ironic because that's exactly the part of the world people wrote off because that's where President Trump wanted to put the wall. So they go, well, there's not going to be any commerce there. There's nothing to do there. No, it turns out that the American businesses say, we're going to use this super nifty piece of technology to handle the wall. It's called an airplane. We're just going to fly over it. Because actually the opportunities in Mexico are so fantastic and even better now that China's building these railways and ports and airports and infrastructure. So I don't know that people aren't starstruck. It's more that I still have to work hard to convey ideas that are out of the market and get people to take them seriously, even if it's just to have a diversity of thinking, not that they actually adopt it. So I don't know. It doesn't kind of matter how senior a person it is. Human beings, they do like to stay in their own little kind of known and understood thought process, and it's hard to shake them out of it.
I think what you just said, that's really interesting. And again, kind of like the Foxconn example, I didn't know about this either. But I wanna ask, why do you think it's a good idea to invest in an airport? Why aren't the Chinese investing in something else, like Carlos Slim's businesses or something? And also, as like a follow-up, I think if you look at Turkey, they're building a massive airport. Do you think that airport is also good, or are they kind of copying Mexico's airport?
Yeah. So I talk a lot about this in both of my recent books, the Leadership Lab and Signals. What China is doing is called the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's the most important infrastructure build out in modern history. It is a massive infrastructure project involving the construction of roads, highways, railway links, ports, airports, bridges, dams. And what it is China realizing they were not competitive in manufacturing any longer. And if they want to create GDP or growth or revenue, they need to do more of it outside the country. And also they need to bring resources back to China because China doesn't have enough water. It doesn't have enough arable land. It cannot feed its population. It must bring resources home, and building this infrastructure is a means of securing those supply lines. But in addition, it's a digital infrastructure. And if you have, if you want the most powerful algorithms in the world, the best way to get it is to run those algorithms over the largest populations. That means you want to be involved in the infrastructure of Africa, of Latin America, of Europe, which is exactly what China is doing. So what's being built in Turkey in their airport is exactly the same phenomena as Mexico. It's about China building a global connectivity back to China, which frankly, the entire world economy will benefit from. Now, there's a huge debate. Is China going to go broke doing this? Or are they heading towards global domination? And you can make both sets of arguments. What I think is important is people haven't even understood the magnitude of the Belt and Road. I think people are kind of stuck with the idea that it's the Silk Road. So they say, well, that's about Kazakhstan, and I'm not doing any business in Central Asia and Kazakhstan, so what do I care? And that's why I constantly show people maps of what it looks like. It goes over the Arctic because China now has the fastest icebreakers and can go from Dalian in eastern China to Rotterdam in like 26 days. It goes from the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal, which they're widening so that you could have those bigger ships and two-way traffic go through the Suez Canal. It's, goes around Africa, around Latin America. China's built ports in places like Djibouti on the east coast of Africa. They're proposing to punch a canal right through Nicaragua to parallel the Panama Canal, but be much bigger. So all of this is about drawing one's attention to this massive infrastructure that will benefit the whole world economy. And the question is, how are we all interfacing with it? Do we even connect the dots that this is what's happening? And most people didn't. They go, wow, I thought it was just a one-off that there's a new port in Oman. I didn't realize it's part of a global strategy.
Pippa, where should we send our audience in terms of your books and websites and Twitter and etc.?
Absolutely. So I'm on Twitter under Dr. Pippa M. I would have just had Pippa M, but the sister of the future Queen of England is called Pippa Middleton, and you just get images of her. So I decided I have to put the doctor in front.
Do you know what Philippa or Pippa means?
I do. Lover of horses in Greek.
Yeah, great. Hippophile. Yeah, all right. Sorry about that. Keep going.
And so I put almost everything up on that I'm doing, every podcast, every kind of paper, either on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm very friendly to people wanting to have a conversation about cool stuff that they see. And the books, the new one is Leadership Lab, Understanding Leadership in the 21st Century. That's on Amazon. And like I said, it's done really well. It's been a surprise bestseller. My previous book, Signals, How Everyday Signs Help Us Navigate the World's Turbulent Economy, is on Amazon in Britain and internationally. Interestingly, it never got released in the US because like the publishers all went, Americans don't care about economics. I'm like, oh my God, they really do. But because they think economics is boring, they kind of didn't get it. And then my first book was called Geopolitics for Investors, which is online and on Amazon. And that one's kind of a big overview of why geopolitics is coming back to life. And those are the things I have out.
What kind of advice would you give to a 30-year-old version of you in terms of becoming better at spotting these signals and interpreting them? For example, how to separate an anecdotal story from a story that actually is a real signal?
Yes, because this is a very personal task. It's not a universal task. It's a personal task because it has to make sense to you. So, for example, I happen to know a lot about sewing because my grandmother was a seamstress and I grew up knowing how to sew. So I like looking at fashion and design because that I understand that. So my advice is you have to go learn real stuff. You have to go experience real things. You can't talk about stuff if you haven't been involved. So find what you love, find what's uncomfortable and outside your comfort zone, and do both of those. And this business will expand your comprehension, your understanding of reality, of the universe, of life. It'll let you connect the dots more effectively. I also think reading really, really matters. I gave up reading novels and reading history for probably 20 years during my career. And it was only maybe after I left the White House in 2002, and I had a daughter who's now 14, that I really felt I missed that. And I went back to it. And what I found was that actually novels and poetry and art, looking at artwork, is just a different kind of language. It's a different way of expressing reality. It's a different interpretation. And the more of that you do, suddenly you will look around and see things you didn't see before. So my honest advice is not that there's, a process or a book or a course. It is, again, go do, go live, go be. In the book, The Leadership Lab, we say people always have a to-do list. What you really need is a to-be list. Be a person who is absorbing popular culture. Be a person who does stuff, not just talks about it. And all of this informs how you see the world, and then you'll be better able to parse apart what matters and what doesn't matter.
That's a really good answer. And then, since I know that you are a history fan, do you, in terms of alternative history, do you think Huey Long could have been president if he hadn't been shot?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I can't really say one way or the other, because if he hadn't been shot, maybe he would have been run over by a truck the next day or the day before. Like, there's no way to come up with those alternative histories confidently, but there is a way to think about alternative histories of the future. That's a concept I like a lot. Alternative histories of the future.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time and knowledge.
You guys are great. I love doing this. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
That was it for today. Remember to subscribe to the Future Skills newsletter.
You can check it out at www.futureskillspodcast.com.
And this episode is edited by Alexander Martin.